our next session will deal with Russian-Israeli relations, which obviously previous sessions have touched upon them, but now we will sort of drill in and get a closer look into this interesting relationship that developed over, let's say, the last decades. And we have with us, I will present the panel. We'll have a very informed panel. We have Dr. Dmitry Maryasis, who was already participated in the first panel. He is the head of the Israel Department and Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Oriental Studies of the Russian Academy of Sciences and at the Skolkovo Business School's Institute for Emerging Markets. You've been already presented, so I cut short this repetition for our audience. Next is Ambassador Gary Koren, Deputy Director General, Head of Eurasia and Western Balkans Division at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, former Ambassador of the State of Israel to the Russian Federation. Ambassador Koren holds a master's degree in political science and national security studies from Haifa University, and an honorary doctorate in security management and criminalistics from the Police Academy of the Czech Republic. Our next panelist is Dr. Vladimir Ze'ev Khanin, an expert on Russian Jewish community in Israel, one of the leading experts on Russian Jewish community in Israel, the diaspora, and on Israeli former Soviet republics relations and politics. Has a PhD in political science from Moscow Institute for African Studies. It was still the USSR Academy of Sciences. And in 1991, he completed postdoctoral studies at the Institute of Russian and Soviet Studies at the University of Oxford, which was still also Soviet studies back then. He currently serves as the chief scientist of the Israeli Ministry of Aliya, Absorption and Integration. He is an associate professor with the Department of Political and Middle Eastern Studies at Ariel University and lectures at Bar Ilan University, as well as a political commentator on several Israelis and foreign TV channels. And our last panelist, Dr. Avinoam Midan. He is from the Geostrategic Khanin Institute, the Khanin Institute of Geostrategy, which focuses on strategic role shaping of international relations, geostrategy shaping international relations. He's a non-resident senior fellow at the Central Asia Caucasus Institute and Silk Road Studies program based in Washington, D.C. He also teaches at the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya, the IDC. And prior to his academic work, he spent over 30 years in government security agency under the Prime Minister's office. And in this framework, he spent 7 years in Moscow during the breakup of the Soviet Union and afterwards. And so he was involved in the establishment of ties between Israel and the newly independent states, Russia, as well in the Caucasus and in Central Asia. So indeed a very informed panel we have with us. And I'll move to our panelists. And also give a sort of a brief introduction to our topic this afternoon. When we speak about Israel and Russia, I think that it's a sort of a curious relationship. I mean, in the context of everything that's been said now about Russia on the global arena and Russia in the Middle East, I think still we see Israel and Russia and the development of the relations as quite curious. And I believe that it's curious because we can sort of, if we run through this relationship, we see so many possible flashpoints. I mean, there are so many flashpoints and so many contradicting interests, so many contradicting points, strategic, geographical, political, economic, and so on. And still we see a relationship that develops in, we can sort of overall summarize in positive terms. And when I'm talking about this flashpoint, we see sort of the contradicting alliances that Russia that Russia establishes in the Middle East that are contradictory to Israeli interests. I mean, it's both in the Muslim world, if we're talking about the Islamic Republic of Iran, as well as in the Arab world. The relationship with the Palestinian Authority, the relationship with Hamas organization. All of these Israel regards as, all of these are sort of red flags for Israel. And this was developing before the involvement in Syria. And then since the intervention in Syria, since October 2015, this even in a way, if you look at it sort of from let's simplify it, it even accelerates because, and this is, I'm quoting here the executive director of this institute, General Amos Yadlin. From the very beginning of Russian involvement, he wrote that let's not forget that Russia joined the Syrian civil war on the side of Israel's worst enemies. So it's Iran, it's Hezbollah, it's the Shia militias, and this is kind of, you know, the clear and simple fact of this intervention. And as well as on the global arena, I mean, we see that sort of since, if we're talking about since 2014, Israel and Russia find themselves on different flanks in the international arena. You can't compare Israel's relations with Russia with Israel's strategic partnership with the US. And the US took a very clear position since Crimea. And to that we can also add sort of voting in international organizations that are often challenging for Israel. And so yet and this is important, yet we find ourselves in a relationship that can be overall regarded as a positive one. And for instance, as Udi mentioned here, and I know that Dima Adamski wrote about it in his articles, that even when Russia joined the war in the civil war in Syria, even though it was on the sort of opposing side, helping Israel's worst enemies, Israel was able to see beyond that. The Israeli decision-making elite was able to see beyond that and look for opportunities and see Russia as this potentially stabilizing power in this region and a power that we should engage in and deepen the dialogue with. And I think that this brings me to sort of a point that I'm making with a colleague of mine from this institute, with Scott Lesensky. We wrote recently a paper, and we described this relationship basically as a relationship where we avoid a zero-sum game. So if on the international arena we see sort of since 2014 and 2015, we see more and more powers that are tending towards a zero-sum game, then Israel and Russia played it differently and played it sort of by avoiding this, very extreme but logical conclusion of every step that each side takes. And so this is I'm not a theoretician in international relations, but if you look at it from international relations point of view, it's either neither realist nor liberal, because we avoid this zero-sum game, we avoid these clashes and these flashpoints. But in the same time, it doesn't mean that we share sort of broad and deep values that build a strong and durable relationship. It's something else. It's something in between. And I think that makes it curious. It also makes it precarious because this is something that you need to keep on doing and keep on performing. So I will start with that. And I'll give the floor to our very esteemed panelists with a wide variety of questions that can arise from this introduction and generally from the relationship, which surely they can describe to us. So we will start, Dmitry, we'll start that way. We'll start from you. Yes.
Thank you. First of all, I'm a little bit humbled to sit in the one panel with the professor who I'm used to study at, whose students, Professor Khanin, was my professor in the institute, so I hope that everything will be okay.
Thank you so much.
About the relations, if you would ask me in one word how I would describe the relations, I would say emotional. And it is bad and good. Why good? Of course, when there is an emotional bond, sometimes you can avoid this zero-sum game by using this emotional side. Like we saw the picture in the first panel, or now Mr. Putin is going to come to Jerusalem on January because of this andarte about this memorial and this memorial in Netanya, and Israel really is one of the least countries in the world that fully acknowledge the role of the Red Army and the understanding of the shares some of the historical values of this World War, how the Red Army behaved itself. So it is very on the one side. On the other side, there is a huge influx of Russian and Soviet culture into Israel, which it is used to perceive in Russia as it is, about the Habima history, about all the issues. You know it better than me. And of course, we have, let's say, more or less several 100,000 people who speak Russian fluently, and another several 100,000 people who at least understand Russian from their ancestry, from their parents. And it is very emotional. And on the one side, on the other side, the religious side, because for the many Russians here, we're linking with my with another Dmitry, with Dima Adamsky, this Russian Orthodox Church and all these issues that are considered very important to Russian Orthodox Church, they're very emotional as well. I mean, religious is not logic. It's in many ways, we can describe, it's not like a faith, but it's as an emotional way of understanding the life as well. In this case, it is good. But on the other case, what I see, what I feel every time I meet with the Israeli experts and Israeli public, that emotions, they bring us to the other way. You are either with us or against us. Once again, if you ask question about Israel, and I'll tell you where it comes from, and it is not pro, and you express not a pro-Israeli view, you are automatically considered as anti-Israeli, not neutral, not maybe thinking about something other issues, not logical, but automatically anti-Israeli. When I try to speak to them, and when I read this paper, I try to understand why it comes from. My answer is, it's my personal opinion, is from the past, from the time of the direct linkage of the Soviet Union to the Arab countries from 67 and now until 1991. I mean, Israelis used to think about Soviets in some terms about Russians as anti-Israeli and pro-Arab. That's why when you try to speak, and many people who now dealing with the Middle East, that were studied in that particular time and started their work as the ambassadors, as the experts in that particular time, and used to be experts in the Arab world with the intentions of and ideological views expressed by that time. So when they ask you a question about Israel, which is not very, or try to criticize Israel in some way, it is considered that it's very pro-Arab understanding or anti-Israeli at least, which is not good. And when you look at the Russian press, which is, I would say, one of the coverage of Israel is, I think, is one of the most favorable. If we see the press, let's compare to European Union or to maybe to at least European Union, I think it's more or less neutral. And there are lots of interesting. The coverage is, I think, we have of course difference, but as a trend, I would say that it's more or less neutral. Even sometimes more positive in the way. There are some issues that, of course, we have harsh comments on this Israeli-Palestinian issues, but still. So, in one word, it is emotional, and I described it. If we look at the relations today, I think basically we have now the best time since the Israel officially was born. Since the 70 years, because of course in the first In the first years, you know it better than me. It was with the help of the Soviet Union, the establishment, and so on and so forth. But just after it, there was a trend to make the relations colder and colder. But since 90s, I think we're on the trend of making the relations better and better, and now we are in the position with the best relations, and it is the longest, to my mind, is the longest period where our relations are more or less stable, and I would say favorable to each other, at least not negative to each other, which is important in bilateral relations between Israel and Russia. I wouldn't say friendly, because I think that meaning friendship is not a correct word in the international relations at all, because it's emotional as well. But I think that they are positive. If we look on different issues, I will leave alone cultural ties, because they are very good, and I hope that they would continue. Habima would come to Moscow and different other parts. And now, for example, if we say about the cultural relations, I would give you a perfect example. Just in a week, or even less than a week, this week, Israel is a official guest in the one of the most known Russian book fairs, non-fiction, and Israel is official guest with them. And a big delegation would come with Orly Kastelblum and others to be in this weekend in Russia. And it is one small example. There are many of them. If we look at the political, social, and economic ties, we have different. I think we have basically a little more or less different trends. I would say that on the social life, we have a very interesting issue. Russia is second or third country, or sometimes in the number of tourists who are coming to Israel. Who are they? It's important to understand. First, of course, they're Jews who have families there, or business. Or business there with Israeli passport or non-Israeli passport, they're constant travelers. We've counted yesterday with our colleagues, we have at least 7 flights per day from Moscow to Israel. And they're fully booked, usually. So another group is Russian Christians who traveling constantly to Israel to see the holy sites. Then we have a different kind of people who come there on only touristic as a touristic location, just including health tourism, medical tourism, and some business people who have business there. So we have very distinct different groups. It's very important, because if you see the tourists who coming from, let's say, France, or US, you see the majority a little bit another in the people of population who is traveling. So there are many interesting social movements back and forth, and Israel is more and more known to many people in Russia. In social level, another issue is very important. I think that when Russia in the 90s, in the beginning 2000, felt the threat of the Islam terrorism, Israel was one of few countries that fully understood and shared Russian, let's say not fully, but at least understood the Russian problem with these terrorism issues. And that's why in this case, I would say that in many ways Israel is looked upon as a successful country that knows how to deal with terrorism and all these security issues, which is very important to Russia and to common people in Russia. There is a common knowledge. Importantly, as it is inbuilt in Russian society, we could clearly say that the present-day establishment is not anti-Semitic and is not anti-Israeli, is philo-Semitic in many ways, and philo-Israeli, I would say, in many ways. And it is translated to the general public. And sometimes people really expressed it that we didn't think that the times would change, and now we would feel that Israel is good. We didn't know about it before, because really, I'm almost quoting. It is important, and if you that the threat of Islamic terrorism is still counting, and Israel is looked perceived in a positive way, and another way is what was, if we say, I don't want to elaborate on this present. Maybe later on, if the questions may be about some, I will finish some my elaborate on this deconflictions issues, because a lot of were talked a lot about it today. Maybe later on, if the questions would arise. The last thing, maybe I'll say a few words about economics. Of course, we used to say that okay, there are good relations in the economic stuff, but in the economic field. But I think that we could do better, because the 80% of Russian export to Israel is power and raw materials. And that's all. And all the rest is some other stuff, but 80% it's important. And I do not think that these are the opportunities that we can share with Israel in the economic future, because there is a notion that there is still an opportunity in high tech, and there is a compatibility of two economic systems and two economics, because in Russia there is still a huge potential in the terms of technology, but Russia still is far away. Here I fully agree with Oksana when she was telling the first panel about the Russian economic position. We don't know how to transfer technology from science to startups to innovations, which Israel knows how to do it perfectly well. And there is still a lot of an opportunity in this field. I don't want to elaborate more on it, but there is, I think, almost missed opportunity, because there is still not a system of this kind of cooperation, which Israel, for example, has with the US and with many other countries. But with Russia, no. I think this is one of the problems and potentials, because we can continue in this way to trade this $3 and $3.5 or even $4 billion per year total trade overall, our trade, which is nothing in terms of percentages, in terms of share, both in Israel and of course in Russia. We can continue this for many years, but there is no perspective. I think that the new economy, the knowledge economy, is the way to cooperate with Israel, and Russia has something to offer, and Israel has, of course, a lot of things to offer in this way, but we're not using the system. And since I think it's one of the major, let's say, drawbacks and problems of our common relations, that since 1991 we're not a success in building a working scheme of scaling up economic ties, even though we have all these commonalities, including language. Even though with language there is a problem, because sometimes they think that language, if we speak the, let's say, common language in Russian, we can substitute it for professional professional cooperation. Sometimes from the both sides we consider if there is someone knows Russian language, he can do everything, he can help. Even if he's not in professional in the field we're trying to cooperate. On the both sides it works, unfortunately. But if we understand it, of course, language, common language and scientific language can be a good asset in hands of the both countries. But up till now we are losing this momentum, and we are not scaling it up, and we are not making it a scheme, a framework of cooperation. By this I would end.
Thank you, Dmitry. And we go. We're not. I'm sorry, we're not taking. We're not
I said it.
taking.
I
If we
I
have
just
more
said it.
time, if we have.
At the beginning.
And we go to Gary.
Good afternoon. Thank you, INSS, for having me here. I'm glad to recognize a few of my colleagues from the past. I'll try not to trivialize things that diplomats are doing as much as I can, because we are sometimes, especially when it comes to relations with Russian federations, dealing with very sensitive areas which I cannot disclose. So keep it in mind as a big asterisk. If I'll try to describe the nature of the relations, I definitely will agree with Dr. Maryasis, who is an excellent scholar and gave you a few nice examples of what's happening in our relations. And yes, I can confirm, as a person who was dealing with relations with the Russian Federation since re-establishment in 91, being in a group of first Israeli diplomats, as a young diplomat who actually was dealing mostly with economic relations in the early 90s. Some of us here, yeah, as well. Some people cannot recognize me, but this is me, yeah. Yeah, it's a positive trend, continuous positive trend of development of relations. A period of 27, 28 years, of them 20 under the rule of President Putin. And definitely the last period, which overlapped partially with my position last 2.5 years in Moscow as Israel ambassador, probably, to say it mildly, was the most interesting. And of course challenging. And probably it will stay in the near future, given mostly not the bilateral nature of relations, but given, of course, our understanding, this is part of our job, understanding of the Russian interests in the Middle East, in our neighborhood, and which of those interests serve the interest of security, national security of the State of Israel, which of them don't serve, and how you deal with this, okay? Again, it's not trivial. There are some simple answers and simple solutions, and there are issues that, especially those who are under direct responsibility of head of states of two sides, which will continue being on our agenda with, hopefully, modest improvement in modest progress. Okay, I can give you one example, which is definitely in the open, and this is our interest to get rid of Iran presence in Syria, and our hopes. You can challenge those hopes, of course, to which extent Russia is, understand Israel interest, speaks about the care, President Putin himself, a care for the security of the state of Israel and its citizens, and what it's doing in this direction, okay? And what steps the state of Israel has to do in order to ensure that Russia works in a tune with, as much as it's possible, with the state of Israel interests. I wouldn't like to touch right now, we are not working in a vacuum when it comes to the Middle East. There are other global powers with interests in Middle East, starting of course with Iran and Turkey, but very much United States, and unclear position of EU, not always clear. We are not here to speak about the EU, and those who came from EU, keep it in proportion, please. And of course of our neighbors in the Middle East, countries like Egypt and Jordan. I will definitely, as a diplomat, can give you, thank you very much, Dr. Michlin. It's always fascinating to hear as practitioner descriptions given by theoreticians of international relations.
Not theoreticians.
You are not personally, but still, we are an academic, to some extent, academic and research institute. It adds some perspective, of course, but to keep it simple, and I'm not discovering anything new, of course, a number of visits of Prime Minister Netanyahu is, I'm not sure I can find a parallel in my diplomatic, let's say, experience. More than 3 decades in the foreign ministry, or even with any other countries. And there is, of course, very much good reason for that.
Rouhani was more than Bibi Netanyahu.
Rouhani.
Unfortunately.
Sima, why you have to spoil?
Let's go, Jerry.
We counted, Gary.
Now, with all the modesty, of course, there is, of course, responsibility of the embassy, and we are very much thankful to the receiving side, to the Russian side, to the foreign ministry, to the protocol of President Putin to ensure that everything goes smoothly. And some of the visits were in very short notice, but it reflects also about, of course, Russian interest for engagement with Israel. But I'm not about that, okay? I'm speaking not about this particular sensitive area of our relations that deals with particular interests of national security. But what we, as a diplomats, on 2 sides, by the way, we are sharing the same burden. I mean, the Russian foreign ministry and the Israeli foreign ministry, how we can leverage, okay, if you'd like, those visits, because you can understand 90% of the time people are dealing, heads of states are dealing with security matters, and hopefully there is agenda that we prepare and our Russian colleagues prepare, which is on the bilateral, non-trivial, very important issues. Because the relations, after all, between the countries are not only relations between the leaders. You know, when I was a student of international relations, Hebrew University, the history of international relations was a history of kings and emperors and so on. But the angle, and you just mentioned, Dima, very fresh example, which is, again, non-trivial. What we do for the sake of the people, okay, and what we do for the sake of building the bilateral package, if you like, agenda of between our countries that will sustain any blow, okay, if you like, or will sustain any challenge, or if you like, will cut the sharp angles, or make them tolerable. And this is something that you have to invest in continuous work. Whether I remember as a young diplomat first visit of Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin to Moscow in 1994, which later, if you like, international law basis to our relations, sense of having a big package of different agreements. We still enjoy those agreements very much. Or if we are thinking about what common people on 2 sides feel about the relations between the countries. And I remember discussions that we had in Israel around 2008, whether to have visa-free regime with Russian Federation, and there were hesitations, and thanks God we have this. So we have more than a decade, 11 years exactly. We have the very easy opportunity for anyone, and you mentioned the number of tourists may be arriving is from 2 sides, it's almost 500,000 people. Actually, there is a growing Israeli tourism to Russia, almost 200,000 per year, and hopefully we'll have a positive trend also, of continuous positive trend with Russian tourists. Whether people come because they have friends, or because they have family, or because it's a business, or because it's a pilgrimage, doesn't matter. We also know that most of them come 2nd, 3rd, and 4th time, because people in Russian Federation who can afford it, of course, very much enjoy Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and holy places and whatever. And I think Of course, media plays a role, but we have a very good feeling about the situation with public opinion in Russian Federation. We don't have the phenomena that exists in some countries, unfortunately, in the West, including very low rate of anti-Semitism, which is not trivial. And by the way, we would like very much that part of our, let's say, diplomatic efforts to bring Russia on board, especially because of the relatively good record to adopt what's called working definition of anti-Semitism, which is outgoing international effort all over the world. I would like also to add another angle of our work beyond saying that the period was very challenging and interesting. Again, it's not a secret we are living in hard times as a Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I present here the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And our budget are going and becoming more and more limited, but this is a general situation with all the government offices, but it influences out directly our capacity to implement different plans and different activities that we think, as a Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as the embassy in Moscow, can serve very positively the issue that I mentioned before, building and bolstering what we have in our hands on bilateral agenda. There are a lot of things that connect us with Russia. There are things that we disagree, very concrete things that we continue to deal with them. But on the positive side of the agenda, definitely we should and we can do much more in cultural sphere because it's a win-win. And the impact is very positive when Russian artists come and visit Israel or when Israeli artists come and visit Russia. And we see the reaction, the positive attitude, not only in Moscow and St. Petersburg, it can be also in the remote places in Russia. And this is another challenge that we have. It's a huge country. In United States, we have 8 general consulates. In Russia, we have only 1. In St. Petersburg, we are hardly reaching region of Volga or southern Russia, not to speak about Siberia and Far East. Yes, we are trying to do with limited resources great things like a visit of, support the visit of Batsheva and to support the visit of Habima and to support with a great appreciation to the Russian side on a prize given to late Amos Oz a year ago, Yasna Polyana, highest literary Russian prize, in this case for foreign literature. We have a very important mechanism, which is, we rarely have it with other countries, again, because of resources mostly, but it reflects priority, and this is Intergovernmental Economic Committee that we keep it ticking every year, despite the fact that, as rightfully Dr. Maryasis mentioned, we probably reached some kind of plateau in our trade relations of 2.5 billion approximately. And the opportunities are there, they're not simple, they're not trivial, but I guess time will come and maybe we can do much more in this field. Last observation, maybe in between the academic world and the world of practitioners. History is coming back in many senses in relations between Russia and the West. It's something that we, of course, very much keep in mind. History is coming back when it comes to Russian interest in the Middle East, whether it was from the times of the Russian Empire, 19th century, purchase of property in Jerusalem and other places. History is coming back to Soviet times when we have Russian military presence in Syria. So those of us who are familiar with those times feel comfortable to some extent. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. And we go to Ze'ev.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Vera. Thanks to Tzvi and thanks for INSS for giving me this floor. I am really grateful to my friends and colleagues, Dr. Dima Maryasis and Ambassador Gary Koren for explaining us so nicely how important for mutual relations the whole public atmosphere which we define as normally as Israel and Russia in the intermirrors, as two sides see each other, but not only general public, but first of all general public, but of course also different elites. Those who are including those whom we define decision makers, diplomats, politicians, and opinion makers. Which majority of people sitting in this room belong to, including analysts, journalists, and so on and so forth, and who also these two groups together, that they impact the opinion, the public opinion in each country concerning each of them, and which in turn impact the decision makers and opinion makers. So from this point of view, I would say that the history of our relations on the public level and on the diplomatic level actually came through the period after the end of the Cold War in the late 1980s. Almost 3 decades this passed since. I would divide them into 3 periods, each one 10 years. The first decade actually was a period which we had a descendancy or heritage, felt the heritage of the Cold War. And two sides probably saw each other in the view of the pre-and Cold War eyes, meaning the two sides belong to very ultimate blocs, and their relations should be conditional rather than unconditional, meaning any step together toward each other should be conditioned with the other steps in a way that it should be part of the so-called general picture. That is why Israel and Russian Federation were hardly able to agree with, besides some of their specific points to that general picture, which everybody, each side applied to each other from the very beginning and to the end. The next decade was a period of changing views, when we are trying to reconcile to the matter that the Cold War is already over, and we have to develop the new concept of mutual relations. As I can see in Russia, and of course here in Israel, we witnessed the conflict between the two camps, probably. In Israel, I would call them Kremlin optimists and Kremlin pessimists. Kremlin optimists believe that Russia is coming back in the Middle East, which actually happened in the second decade after the end of the Cold War. It was pretty clear also in 1990s, early 90s, but that happened already in the first decade of this century. So this first group believed that Russia comes back in the Middle East as not as a barrier of the specific ideology, but just in the pragmatic force, which is interested in diplomatic, economic, political, and strategic solutions. And the second group, which I would call Kremlin pessimists, which believe that Russia will be always on the other side, Israel and Russia, on the different sides of the political or diplomatic barricades, so we can reach some understanding, but strategic partnership is something which might be probably obtained in the very distant future. This decade, which we are witnessing, is actually, I would call them, a period of unconditional relations. So two sides adopted, as I can see the situation, the idea of so-called the concept of unclosed three angles. We understand that Moscow and Jerusalem have loyalties of their own. And it not necessarily would happen like it was during the First and the Second World War, that the friend of mine is also the friend of my friend. As Benjamin Netanyahu once said, the enemy of your enemy is also your enemy. But on the other hand, we can say that, for instance, I once heard one of the very important political commentators in Moscow who said that Russia at the moment has two close allies in the Middle East, Israel and Iran. Everybody sitting in this room knows that relations between Israel and Iran knew better days, as well as the situation which is concerning Israel-Turkey relations, which now has close relations with Moscow as well, also interrupted by some unpleasant events. However, it doesn't prevent two sides from adopting the idea of so-called unconditional relations, meaning we agree upon what we are able to agree and are ready to put out of brackets the issues we are unable to agree. And that's probably better than we experienced in the two previous decades. This situation makes it impact on three major issues of our bilateral relations between Israel and the Russian Federations, which are important to the both countries. The first field are actually global stand vis-à-vis each other. It might be maybe a little bit funny to discuss the stand of small Israel and huge Russian Federation on the global stand. However, both sides do not ready, at least since recently, to see it as a joke. Again, quoting Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, he once was in Moscow and met it like what was said like an anecdote, but it's absolutely true. At least people believe in that. So the thing that we believe, it doesn't matter whether it happened or not. Yeah, but people saw our Prime Minister addressing to Jewish and non-Jewish public and answering the question came from the audience: how he's able to define three major superpowers in the modern world. Netanyahu said, of course we have three superpowers. The first are United States. The second is China, and the third is Google. Then he stopped for a second and said, and Google, this is ours. So everybody were ready to smile, but paid attention that majority of the audience were ready to take it for granted. They said, okay, yeah. Everybody knows that. So that's actually the global stand. Of course, we have to take into account the regional stand. Here, Israel and Russia came to a certain number of understandings that we heard in the previous panels, and there is no need to come back to that, to share the spheres of interest and influence, and until either of the side will cross the red line, but everybody, both Moscow and Jerusalem, makes everything in their power in order not to cross it. And finally, bilateral relations in the full meaning of the word, including diplomacy, culture, economy, and so on and so forth. So continuing what my colleagues said, I would like to add maybe some sociological data which will show which impact it makes on the public level. Gary, may I disturb you for a second just to show people to have a look at that?
First time to disturb me.
Yeah, I know. I was an annoying guest in Moscow, I know. Okay, so first of all, let us have a look what is going on from on the Russian side. Here you see the results of the sociological studies that were done by Levada Center, which shows that in principle that Russia, in the opinion, or in the eyes of the Russian public opinion, Israeli stand is more or less positive. So majority see it either with the interest and sympathy or like any other country, which is probably the best we can get in this period of time. Public attitude toward Israel, as you see, the new ups and downs, but continues, but remains more positive than negative, which, of course, is a good atmosphere for the development of this concept we were talking about. 10 years ago, just an example of what happened, we experienced not an easy period of time when during the so-called Second Lebanon War, the Israeli and Russian public opinion clashed over the understanding who is right and wrong in this issue. Before, when the Second Intifada started, and various Russian and Israeli media assets, they explained to the public different opinions concerning what they should think about the opinion of the other side. So here you can see, but on the other hand, despite all that, majority of the Russian public believe that that's internal issue of Israel and Palestinian Arabs, and that's upon them to solve them, which is also quite a good conclusion of that situation. In principle, it once again came in the model of allusions, meaning both in Russia and Ukraine, by the way, it is quite fashionable to see the other side, Israel, as well as Israel sometimes see Russia, in concern of in allusion way of the problems they experience now. For instance, it's quite fashionable now in Russia and Ukraine understand their conflict in the way of Israeli-Palestinian conflict or Israeli-Arab conflict. And of course, while Ukrainians believe that it's very easy to understand everything, that the Gaza Strip and Judea and Samaria is like Crimea and Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk. In Russia, it is quite fashionable in some ways to understand what happens in Israel as the Ukraine as a part of the conquered Jewish lands and so on. But still, it has nothing to do with the reality, but it makes its contribution to the mutual vision of the two countries. I would like to stress, I'm happy to stress that another fashion, which is quite widespread in the European Union and in some other parts of the Western world, the so-called vision of what is defined the BDS or negative vision of Israel's stand of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, quite rooted in the local intelligentsia. This fashion didn't come to Russia yet. You see here and there some ideas and proclamations, but in general, intellectual circles and political makers, they're out of this discussion at the moment, which is, to my mind, is a good idea. What happens on the other side, including on that part of the globe which our small but very huge and important country situates. In principle, while we're talking about that, we are thinking of the general Israeli public, but also that or about 1 million Olim returnees, new citizens. I'm trying not to say word immigrants, which they are not actually. Yeah, I mean comings back home to their historical homeland, which are actually always an indicator of what Israel, how Israel views and how Israel. What Israel thinks about Russia. Some people believe that it should be a pro-Russian lobby. Some people believe that it should be just an indicator of the trends, in public opinion trends, that are in this country. You can see that different widespread representable opinion polls, which I was involved into, or actually directed them, they show that overwhelming majority from day to day, from time to time, they believe that Israel should have good relations with the Russian Federation, but not at the expense of the its major ally, which is the United States. Only between 4 to 10%. The 10% were 2014, before their Russian-Ukrainian conflict, or at the very beginning of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, or on the top probably of the humanitarian relations between Russia and Israel, but still not more than 10%. They believe that Israel should exchange United States with Russia and to establish so-called strategic partnership with the two countries. Very few either believe that we should keep equal distance between the major power centers. I'm not sure that's what Israel at the moment is able to adopt the concept. and almost a quarter, between quarter and one-third, as you can see, only, I would say, concerning the history of relations between Israel and the Soviet Union. They believe that that Russia will never be a good friend of Israel, so Israel should refrain from keeping contacts with that country. So I would say that the whole, while we are talking about the community of Olim from the former Soviet Union, that about 1 million people, I have to be exact as the chief scientist of the absorption ministry, 908,275 according to 6 o'clock yesterday. Of course, this group is not just comers, old and newcomers from Russia. We have people from all former Soviet republics, and as it was said here, still of 1.5 million Olim that came to Israel in the recent 30 years, a quarter came from Russia, a quarter from Ukraine, a quarter from the rest of the Soviet republics, and a quarter from the rest countries of the world. If you will take into account people coming from the various areas, we do not see a substantial difference between those who came from various areas of Ukraine, according to the research of 2015, and those who came from Russia. The situation changed 5 years later, almost 4 or 5 years later. You can see here that still about 10% believe in the partnership with Russia at the mayor LA. However, now we can see a difference between those who came from the areas of so-called Russian-Ukrainian dispute, and because within these 3 or 4 recent years, a new substantial group of Olim was added to this Russian-speaking community or Russian listening community in the state of Israel, we are all the time we are witnessing the discussions that about the very, very, very deep split in the Russian-Israel community between pro-Ukrainian and pro-Russian patriots or supporters, which to my mind is very far from the fact, and I will try to prove it in a second. However, we can see here that I might say, the Russian-speaking community in Israel is as different according to this issue as the whole Israeli society in general. One of the indications were results of the recent elections of the Russian president in Israel. You can see here the local Russian constituency, results of the elections in the Russian Federation, results among Russian Israelis and Russian Americans. You can see here that Vladimir Putin was supported by the more or less the same share of those who participated in the elections. Please take into account only the fact that the showing up in Russia was about 70%, and the showing up in the United States and Israel was only about 8% of those who were eligible to vote in Russian presidential elections. But still, we have more or less the same figures in the 3 constituencies. I might also say that it is funny that more or less the same share were given in Tel Aviv and Haifa, like in Moscow and Leningrad, St. Petersburg, and the same share in big Israeli cities, like in the European part of the Russian Federation, and the same share in the small population centers, like in the Russian periphery. However, you can see that as usual, the so-called liberal candidates, civic liberal or economic liberal candidates, got much more than they got in Russia. What does it mean? It means, to my mind, that overwhelming majority of the Russian Israelis, their political culture is a much more a result of Israeli experience rather than Soviet or post-Soviet heritage. We can prove it with their way how their public see the contemporary Russian-Ukrainian conflict, which is about to come to an end. At least we all hope about that. On that. So you can see here that like 5 years ago, only about 10% of those who came from the former Soviet Union, they took either stand, support of either party, and believe that the state of Israel should also take this side, a side of one of them. You can see here that about 40% they sympathized with one of the sides, but believe that for Israel it's not necessary to interfere, and about half of them they believe that this is not our issue at all. A few years ago, the situation changed. Twice less, only 5%, took an active side, only a quarter took a so-called non-active positive or negative side, and 2/3 believe this is not an our issue. Yeah, it doesn't mean that Russian Israelis, like Israelis in general, they do not sympathize with their friends, with their relatives. They forgot about the memories of their childhood, of their grown-up period. However, they are thinking, observing the situation through the eyes of the Israeli citizens rather than those who came from the former Soviet Union and more interested in what is going on there than what is going on here. I would say that it would be a good conclusion to what I was going to say, but I believe that all that creates a very positive atmosphere for the other sides, for the other vectors of our possible relations. And would you agree with me or not? I would say that it's a good piece of news. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ze'ev. Very interesting sort of sociological perspective to this debate, and we go now to Avinoam.
One very brief comment to my friend Ze'ev. You divided the criminalist optimist and pessimist. I would establish the group, the realist group, if you are not against it.
Who of the both?
Well, but anyway, what I like, I represent here I'll jump to my conclusion. And my conclusion is that we are very close to a crucial moment in confrontation between Israel and Russia. And this is the zero-sum game and thank you, Vera, for raising this question, because I think this is very crucial. And I would not trust public opinions. I apologize. I hope that my Prime Minister, his foreign policy and his policy at all is not based on public opinion. This is my own view. I would like to quote one of E.H.D. Carr. Carr was a British political scientist and also intelligence officer during the Second World War. He has a beautiful book I highly recommend for students among us. And I would like to quote him, and this is my mantra when I'm talking with my students about international relations. He say that, to say it, look at the reality as it is and not as you want it to be. And there is no way for emotions the way I would like to analyze the Russians' policy in our region and what I would like to see the Israeli strategic at the same region. I would not like to see too much emotions. I wouldn't like to see too much personal diplomacy, and I think that we should be more realist. And that's the quotation of E.H. Carr, which I totally accept. I would like to mention one of the reasons why I think that the failure of some of the Western countries to understanding the Russian foreign policy and strategy and analyzing superpowers strategy, I would look beyond this, our neighboring countries, countries like Turkey, of course. I would include also the Caucasus, the Southern Caucasus, the Northern Caucasus, it's Russia, and so. And Syria is only one piece in the puzzle of the Russian strategy. If I want to make any analysis of the Russian geostrategy, I won't stop in Ukrainian crisis. I'll go back even earlier, and I had the luck. I was based in Soviet Union several years before the breakup of the Soviet Union. So I think it gives me any advantage in order to understand what Putin, the President Putin, said he addressed the nation or a group of high-level politicians, and that was in 2005. I think it was in April. And what he said that time, that he saw the breakup of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. Catastrophe depends on translation. I know there is a debate about, but let's, for our friendship, catastrophe. And that was something that I can understand it. I mean, you should remember his memories from those years of the breakup of the Soviet Union. And I'm not going only about, losing these 15 republics as a result of the breakup, but let's go to his personal experience. And again, it was well known that he was a KGB officer, I think podpolkovnik, that's not so senior, but at that time he was posted in Dresden, in Germany, East Germany. And the people were demonstrating near the place of the office of the Residentura, of the office of the KGB in Dresden. And just imagine, if you understand the Russian spirit, and he was calling the center in Lubyanka in Moscow, trying to get some instruction what to do. And there was no answer. And if you understand the spirit and the atmosphere of the Soviet Union, calling the center and not getting any reply and any answer, it's really a kind of shock for a person like Putin those years. So when he mentioned that was the tragedy of the 20th or catastrophe of the 20th century, we should really understand it in the Soviet, in the Russian way. Not I live in Haifa, so not the way we understand it here in the West, and not we understand it in Israel. And I see these events, I mean, of course, the breakup of the Soviet Union and his own experience, something which is really shaping the Russian geostrategic strategy from there on. And if I take these pieces of the big picture puzzle, so let's remember again, I mean, the previous panels, they ignored war in Georgia, the conflict between Russia and Georgia. We almost forgot it. But that was the first time Russia, let me say, invaded. I know there is a big question about who started the war, whatsoever. I don't want to start this debate. But anyway, Russia invaded Georgia. The first time Russia invasion one of its own previous or ex-republics. That was something very significant. And of course, that was the backyard. I mean, from the Russian perspective, that is the backyard of Russia. A very important strategically, Georgia, and the heart of the Southern Caucasus, on the crossroad between East and West, between Europe and the Central Asia, and beyond that to China. And so then that was the point when Russia really gained, it was a very significant advantage for Russia to get the control over this bottleneck between East and West. And not only that, Russia established two, I would say, client states. I don't know if the South Ossetia and Abkhazia. South Abkhazia at the heart of this region. In Abkhazia, you get 200 kilometers of the coast of the Black Sea, something which Russia lost the most of it as a result of the breakup of the Soviet Union. And these are two small countries recognized by only, I think, 2 or 3 countries in the international community. They are client states, and these are really post of Russia, Putin in this part of the world. That was the Caucasus and the war between Russia and Georgia, 2008. If we count 5 years later, that's of course the Ukrainian crisis and annexation of Crimea. So then Russia first taking the Caucasus, strategic point, and then in effect strategically take almost the control over the Black Sea, at least the hegemony of the Black Sea. And not only that, we have now the bridge from over the Kerch Strait, so you don't have to take a boat in order to go to Sevastopol. You can take a car, something like this. So that was the second step of Russia, geostrategic steps, 5 years after the war, the conflict in the heart of the Caucasus. And then 2 years later, I think, yes, that was Syria. This, the Caucasus, the Black Sea, and the East Med, the eastern part of the Mediterranean. Well, I think we don't have to say much about the strategic point for the Russian geostrategy and interest. Air base, naval base, forces on the ground. As we mentioned the name of Iran here more than once, we should remember and we should express it that was a cooperation, cooperation between Russia and Iran, the Syrian project. So if some previous panels tried to think about, what the future of the relations between Russia and Iran, we should remember that Syria is not, it was a very close cooperation between the two actors, and we should remember it also, not only the past, but also the future of the relations between these two countries in the region and in Syria. And by the way, by Syria, we should remember also that besides these regional aspects of the Russian activity in Syria, there was also a message on the global arena, because that was some kind of answer or reply to the Western countries which were trying to interfere within the internal politics in Russia and the region, the color revolutions. So we can see it as something that was not like from this Russian activity in Syria. To save Assad, that was the slogan of the previous administration in the White House, that, Assad must go. Well, and now we have Assad must stay. So that was not only regional important, but that was also a kind of reaction of the Russians and Putin, this kind of strategy, Assad must stay. And, well, we see that it's happened to be the reality. So now I'll say a word about from the Israeli perspective. Well, we should look at the reality as it is. This is the agreement between us now. So we should look at it as it is, the reality as it is. And the reality is that Israel faces a very new and geopolitical environment. Israel faces a very challenging reality, geostrategic reality. And the big question is, what next? And apologize, I cannot be optimistic about that. But I don't see, and I think I'm not the only one who, well, if I would, wishful thinking, it's fine. I mean, there is something happening between Russia and Iran. Iran is left behind. Russia is choosing, and it was mentioned here on the previous panel, that Russia must choose someone because she's talking with everybody. But I don't think that it's really realistic to expect Russia choosing Iran, as Iran is a strategic global partner and ally of Russia on the global arena. There is US, there is the region, that part of the world, the Persian Gulf or whatever. So as we don't expect Russia to leave Iran, so then it's a zero-sum game. It's either Iran, or at least from the Israeli policy and view, no way. I mean, Israel cannot accept Iran along its border. That's the policy. That is something that we can understand, and it's something serious. It's not something for the, let's say, for the public opinion in Israel. It's real. We cannot afford it. So in case we are coming closer to the crucial point that this zero-sum game is going to be something very serious, I don't know, of course, that it's too early, or it's not not the topic of our panel. Thank you that you didn't raise this question. But it's not our topic now, but I think that we have Israel, if I would recommend to someone about it, so I would say that Israel has to be prepared to a new phase of this environment, geostrategic reality, and it means that we might find ourselves with a confrontation with Russia. And I like the Russian literature. One of my relatives was a well-known composer in Russia in the years ago. And so there is nothing to do about it, no emotions, no literature, no public opinion, nothing. This is the geostrategic reality. And we have, our decision makers at least, they have to be prepared to a new phase, a new reality in geostrategic environment. And if I may add another few words, I would, there's a very, I think it's not funny in this context joke, but we can say there's a joke that, you know, when a bear asks you to dance, yes? It's fine, but he is the one to decide when to stop the music. So just think that you can learn something from this very nice, I don't know how to call it, but it sounds really very relevant to our situation. And I would like just only briefly to say that I am not among those who are really proud of the close relation between our Prime Minister, Netanyahu, and President Putin. This personal diplomacy, I found this term, but this personal diplomacy, I see it as a weak point in the Israeli foreign policy. And as we know, by the way, that President Putin is really a master in this type of global diplomacy. I would prefer to see the Israeli ambassador in Moscow doing a lot of the job instead of, the Israeli Prime Minister is on the plane so often, this case, the S-300, S-400, every time President Putin wants to see Netanyahu, you can see that the Russians are going to sell to supply to the S-300 either to Syria, to Iran, whatever, and I just want to finish with story that I think that I owe you. This story that the perfect, great example of this global. This is personal diplomacy in the past were the special relations between President Putin and Gerhard Schroeder, who was the Prime Minister of Germany. And when Russia wanted to build this Nord Stream, this is a strategic gas pipeline going from near the area of St. Petersburg down to Germany, under the sea, the Baltic Sea. And no banks, no financial institutions wanted to give the money for this huge strategic project. And then Gerhard Schroeder helped Russia and President Putin. And then the banks, Western banks, and the government of Germany, they helped. And so the money was given, and then the project, by the way, it's in the headlines these days, the phase 2 of the Nord Stream gas pipeline, and it was done. So, exactly. And then Gerhard Schroeder, Mr. Schroeder, Prime Minister, Mr. Schroeder finished with this project, giving the Russians government and President Putin the money. The banks and all this deal was done about 2 or 3 weeks before he finished his term as a prime minister, and about several weeks after that, when he finished his term, after that, he became the head of the board of the Nord Stream concern, Gazprom, whatever. And that was a great product of personal diplomacy. Thank you.
Thank you, Avinoam. So, I mean, you're saying that we should ask Netanyahu what kind of position he's eyeing. These are as a complete joke. Yes. Well, no jokes in our subject. Okay. Well. Thank you so much for your presentations. Actually, we don't have a huge amount of time, but I think that I think it will be good to follow up still with some points. I very much agree both with Dmitry and Gary in the sense that if you look at the kind of long durée, if you look at the relationship over decades, you see an overall obvious positive trend. I mean, you can't ignore that. But if in this institute we are focused to a large extent on the here, not say necessarily on the here and now or on current affairs, which are really current. And certainly if I can bring it to the shorter durée in this relationship and focus on a specific incident that happened just over a year ago in September 2018, which is the downing of the Russian plane, the downing of the Ilyushin in Syria. And there was a real sense of a turbulence in the relationship. There was a long period over which it was unclear whether the relationship would really sustain this blow. And it was unclear how we come out and what kind of relationship comes out on the other side. So, I mean, we are seeing these spots, we are seeing these flashpoints that are coming up. And my sense is that we are still not completely over this, that we are still, again, going in the short durée, that we're still finding ourselves in a tough spot in Israeli-Russian relations, and I would be happy to hear your views about this incident and how we did or did not get over this. And related to that, another issue that was raised here both by Gary and Dmitry was the cultural and economic ties, which are kind of, and this is Gary, you said that this is a possible solution that would help us to sustain any blow, as you said. But it seems to me that this is, and this is also to Ze'ev, it seems to me that this is kind of a common language in a fairly small, limited group of people in Israel that know Russia, that speak Russian, that do business in Russia, and then the kind of more general population is less aware, less involved, and this is kind of a party by invitation only. So if we want to scale up this relationship, obviously more invitations should be sent out, or it should be an event open to the general public. So how do you do that in the current realities? And I think my last question, we don't have a lot of time, is that the issue of red lines in this relationship. I mean, Ze'ev, you spoke about this unconditional relationship. I think that it's very hard to believe that two countries really can have an unconditional relationship in a full sense. So, I mean, at some point well, I mean, yeah, but at some point, and this is also a question to you, kind of to focus this. I mean, where are we heading in this? I mean, where can we chart these red lines? I mean, if we're talking about, in this institute, we're talking about the next war in the north, not even the third Lebanon War, but the next war in the north. I mean, these are things that are real, that are part of the geostrategic environment here in Israel. Avinoam touched on them. If we're talking about, say, after the presidential elections in the US, if there is a new US president, how does this relationship looks like? So all these factors are coming in. And my last point, and this is really, I mean, this is for your kind of, it's your decision whether to comment on this, but we have a curious sort of incident. We had a curious incident with an Israeli girl that was detained in Russia. Her name is Maryasis, and she still is in a Russian prison. And I mean, this goes to your description of the relationship as being very emotional. I think it's important to mention that because the emotional impact in Israel, the emotional kind of wave over this issue was very, very strong. So if you want to comment on that, I think that would also be interesting for our audience. So please, we'll begin with Michel.
Okay, I'll try to make it short. Well, of course, I'll start maybe with this airplane issue. I think that Gary knows it much more than me because he was in charge. I think you were in the embassy by then. Was that happened here? It was you were in Moscow. So my reading is that I saw two different trends simultaneously developing in Russia by that time. One was from the army side, and the other was from the political side. Simultaneously, you would see the briefings of the army headquarters, the chief of staff, and briefings. Is a very harsh stand on Israel, like almost like a betrayal. It sounded like almost like that. And on the other side, Putin himself and the political side of this issue said that everything could happen. Just relax. Not relax. It's not it's a hard issue, but still everything could happen. We have to understand it. We have to work it out and to understand what's going on. But still, life is going on. It is a very sad and tragic event. But still, we have to continue our cooperation with Israel. It was done simultaneously. By the way, it is very interesting. I don't have an answer to it. I am talking on my own. I don't have an answer to it. When General Norkin came to Moscow with all the documents, there was another briefing, and I had to comment it because media was calling instantly. So I looked at the briefing several times. The only thing that I didn't find there was Israel. I mean, I thought that the briefing will be like that. Even though Israelis brought us these documents, but we don't agree with them because this, and that's our vision. But in the briefing, they said nothing, as though the chief of Israel Air Force didn't come to Moscow, didn't provide any documentation, and didn't do anything in order to defend Israelis, let's say, position on the issue and provide the documentation. I don't know the answer for it, but that's what has happened. And on the other side, we saw this political continuing saying that let's calm down, and the press was calmed down, which had some of the media had a very harsh stance on Israel for the issue, but then it calmed down, and we continued. So my reading it is that maybe it is more of an inward Russian politics than it is connected to Israel. This is my assumption. So if we continue this issue with this Sahar, I don't have an answer because we used to in Russia. People say, okay, officially it was like not according to the law and so on and so forth. I don't think that that is the issue. But I would say that maybe it is the same matter of inner Russian politics that's occasionally directed to Israel, which is not good at all, and I think we will have hard times of continuing to work on this issue and somehow to overcome the problem. And I do believe that, and I hope that she would be returned home here to Israel. This is my personal viewpoint, and I said it openly in the Russian media, because I don't think that is the right way to conduct international relations. Even though we could consider that maybe she was not that right. But still, there were not her intentions, and I don't think that it is the best way to cooperate with the foreign countries, especially with the countries that we tend to have special relations, at least in the conflict, in the Syrian confliction. As for the economics stuff, I would love to speak a lot about economics and about the new economics and about the way how we can overcome all these obstacles that we have, because I have my own ideas about it, and that's my, let's say, major in my research work. That's why I don't want to do it, because it would take a long time. I would say that sometimes, I don't know how it's in English and in Hebrew as well. Самосбывающееся пророчество, the prophecy that makes on its own self-fulfilled prophecy. That if we prophet that sometime Israel and Russia would collapse with each other in the battlefield, it would happen. I don't want to it happen. That's why for us here, and I feel my responsibility of sitting here in this very important conference in our very important discussion today is not to prevent it and not even to think about it, but to find the ways to cooperate. Once again, we don't need to be friends. Every country has its own national interests that sometimes contradict each other. It's normal, it's acceptable, it is the only way for each country to behave. But we have to listen to each other to understand the national interests of each other. And by this I would end. It is very interesting trend. When the Soviet Union collapsed, there different centers of Israeli studies appeared all over Russia. Not only in Moscow and St. Petersburg, in Tomsk, in Kazan, in Nizhny Novgorod. And new studies on modern Israel appeared with Hebrew studies, and not only Jewish. I not speak about the Jewish community, I speak about general public. Here, and not only here in the Western world, all the Soviet studies almost collapsed. There was no need of present Russia study. Look at the numbers. And that's not the way to conduct. If we want to continue, we have to study each other in good and in bad. We don't need studies when it's already bad. We need studies not to make our relations bad. That's a different trend. And today, in my department of the Israeli Studies department in Moscow, there are 15 people just in my department of Israeli Studies in Moscow who are studying Israel. And most of us, even part of us and the youngest who were taken out, even the older generation, they don't know Hebrew, unfortunately, because of the Soviet time issue. But of the younger generation, we try to take those who read, write, and speak Hebrew in order to understand what's going on, in order to understand the cultural issue, and in order really to understand and to prevent this collision. Thank you.
Thank you, Dmitry. Thank you so much. Gary, if just in a few minutes, because...
Yeah, I'll be very short. First of all, really, I cannot. Don't expect me to relate to the details of things.
No, well, of course we understand that. Within the scope of what you can
in a
talk
general
about.
context, look, I'll try to relate to words of Dr. Edan and Dr. Maryasis. In a sense, we respect and we listen to different opinions. I think we have our own expertise, and I'm sure that the decision makers are provided by the best expertise coming from different sources in Israeli, let's say, establishment. Our role, now speaking on behalf of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the ex-ambassador in Moscow, and actually it's a role of any diplomat, is not to harm. When we talk too much, we create a lot of public noise, which not necessarily helps the issues, okay? Whether it deals with Naama Issachar, and we're very much hopeful that she will be safe home, but we can only, let's say, raise our hopes and to do our best. And yes, we're dealing sometimes in cosmetics, but who not is dealing in cosmetics. We're trying to put plasters. We're trying to make things better because the other option leaves the field not to the diplomats, okay? And I think it's a mutual desire on two sides. We very much respect Russian diplomacy and the work they do. They serve their own interests, of course. We disagree on some substantial issues, okay? But our role is to do it in a civilized way, trying to convince. I think things that you mentioned on the incident didn't escape our mind, didn't escape our eyes. And I think, like in many countries, definitely in Russian Federation, the term of Ruach HaMfaked is of a crucial importance. How to say in English, Ruach HaMfaked? Officer spirit. Yeah, again.
Commander's message.
I think let's not, let's say, put ourselves in too many illusions as well. But the incident was contained. I was telling to Ze'ev before, Vladimir Khanin, Dr. Khanin, that we carried this year a much a newer poll of public opinion in Russia, half a year after the incident, and its results much better, even much better. Okay. So, yes, we do look on public opinion. We'd also look with whom we are dealing, whether it's Russian diplomats or the leadership. And we feel quite satisfied. Okay, believe me, we would like to keep this azimuth of our direction working. We are satisfied with the relations, with the intensity, not only with the visits of prime ministers, many other things we discussed with Russia, with Russian diplomats and Russian think tanks, many things happening because it's our role to understand what Russia is doing and what are the interests of Russia. We took an initiative speaking about expertise that reappeared in Russia in a new era on Israel. We took an initiative as an embassy. And we had here representatives of Gimel, or she left?
I think she just left.
Yeah. We introduced a course on modern Israel for the last 3 years about modern Israel in Gimel, which is the most leading university who prepares the future, let's say, diplomats of Russia. And it was taken with great interest by the Russian side, and it was well attended. And we brought a lot of Israeli experts. So to create to the people who are dealing with Israel the best possible picture, whether it starts with the roots of the Zionism in Russian, with Tsarist Russia, or with Yaroslav, speaking about Yaroslav, we just held a seminar on Ze'ev Jabotinsky in Russia. Who could believe it about, in Moscow, St. Petersburg, in Yaroslav, where he finished his magistrate in law. So this is the things that we are doing, and we'll do our best to leave the incidents behind. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Yes, please.
Well, just 1 minute to add, answering your question and a very short comment to my friend Avinoam opinion. I would say when we're asking question, how can we define Israel-Russian relations, I would say that they as good as they could be. They could be possible. So that's the answer to a question where the red lines. And here we are coming back to the issue of conditionalism and unconditionalism. What we could agree, we could agree unconditionally. But of course, as Avinoam said, we cannot compromise the presence of Iran on their Syrian side of the Golan Heights. Okay. Now coming back to your question, to your idea, Avinoam, you believe that it could not last for a long future, and at some point we might. Hopefully we will not, but we might come to the clash with Russia. But I'm not sure that we should jump the previous period, immediately go to the clash. Maybe we will try to do something else between. And that's coming back to the idea of sharing the understandings, the areas of influence, and trying to put out of brackets what we are unable to agree, but try to go on with the points, and the issues that my colleague said that we are able to agree. Concerning the personal democracy, personal diplomacy and personal democracy as well. Democracy for one, yeah. That's we have enough regimes in our area for that. So concerning personal diplomacy, I would say that many in this country would probably like to have the situation that the public opinion will be busy with their results of the soccer teams, and rather than with international relations, and that the Prime Minister will see his colleagues, Mr. Putin, Mr. Trump, Mr. Modi, Mrs. Angela Merkel, and other people once a year from the respectable distance, somewhere in the national conferences. But for all that, we should have asked our forefathers to establish the Jewish state somewhere between Belgium and Luxembourg. Yeah? But what we could do if we are in this area, probably there are some issues that without personal diplomacy is impossible to solve, and it has, of course, happens not at the expense of the excellent job which the diplomats, including our friend and colleague Gary Koren, are doing day-to-day level.
Thank you, Ze'ev, and passing to you, Avinoam.
One sentence, I agree with my friend Ze'ev. Thank you.